The dust cloud rising from the stagecoach wheels seemed to carry all of Lydia Harper's hopes and fears as she clutched the single photograph in her gloved hand. Her future husband's face staring back at her through the sepia tones. A stranger who had promised her a new life in the untamed territory of New Mexico in the spring of 1878. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 3 weeks, each mile carrying her further from the suffocating expectations of her aunt's household and closer to a man named Daniel Lawson, a cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in the eastern newspapers seeking a wife. His words simple, but somehow reaching across the distance to touch something deep within her heart that yearned for purpose and belonging. Lydia pressed her palm against the window of the swaying coach, watching the landscape transform from green hills to golden plains, and finally, to the rust-colored earth, dotted with scrub brush and distant mesas that seemed to touch the endless blue sky. She was 22 years old, considered nearly a spinster by Philadelphia society standards. Her parents gone these 5 years past from fever, leaving her dependent on relatives who made clear she was a burden they tolerated rather than welcomed. When she had seen Daniel's advertisement, something within her had stirred, a desperate courage she did not know she possessed, until she found herself writing a response in the quiet hours of the night, her pen scratching across paper as she tried to present herself as worthy of a chance at a new beginning. The correspondence had been brief, but earnest. Daniel wrote in simple, direct sentences about his ranch outside Las Lunas, about the cattle he raised, about the land that stretched as far as the eye could see, about needing a partner to share the burden and beauty of frontier life. He was 28, he had written, established enough to provide for a family but lonely in ways that the vast, empty spaces of New Mexico seemed to amplify rather than fill. Lydia had responded with cautious optimism, sharing carefully selected details about her education, her domestic skills, her willingness to embrace a life so different from anything she had known. She did not mention the desperation that had driven her to answer his advertisement, the nights she had lain awake wondering if marrying a stranger could possibly be worse than slowly withering away in her aunt's cold household, invisible and unwanted. 3 months of letters had led to this moment, to her stepping off the stagecoach in Las Lunas with nothing but 2 battered trunks and a heart beating so hard she thought it might crack through her ribs. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of adobe buildings clustered along a dusty main street, wooden structures with false fronts trying to look more substantial than they were, horses tied to hitching posts, and people moving with the unhurried pace of those who measured time by seasons rather than hours. The air smelled different here, dry and clean with hints of sage and something else she could not name, and the sun beat down with an intensity that made her grateful for her bonnet, even as sweat began to gather beneath her traveling dress. "Miss Harper." The voice came from behind her, deep and slightly uncertain, and Lydia turned to see a man standing a few feet away, his hat held in both hands, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat. He was taller than she had expected from the photograph, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, his dark hair curling slightly at the collar of his shirt, his face angular with high cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed with a few days' stubble. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark blue like the sky just before full night falls, and they were looking at her with something that seemed like wonder mixed with relief. "Mr. Lawson." She managed, her voice smaller than she intended, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after weeks of travel, how her dress was creased and dusty, how her hair had escaped its careful pins to curl around her face in the dry heat. He took a step closer, and she could see his hands tightening on the brim of his hat, could see the way his throat worked as he swallowed. "You're more than I dreamed," he said, the words rough and honest, and something in Lydia's chest loosened and tightened all at once because there was no artifice in his voice, no practiced charm, only a kind of awed sincerity that made her feel seen in a way she had not been in years. She felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. Thank you," she whispered, not knowing what else to say to such a declaration from a man she had only just laid eyes upon in the flesh. He was handsome in a rugged way that the photograph had not quite captured, but more than that, there was something solid about him, something steady that made her feel less adrift than she had felt since leaving Philadelphia. Daniel seemed to realize he had spoken more boldly than perhaps was appropriate for a first meeting, and he shifted his weight, a faint color rising beneath his tan. "I'm sorry, that was forward of me. The photograph you sent did not do you justice, Miss Harper. The journey must have been difficult. Are you tired? Hungry? I have a wagon ready to take us to the ranch, but we can stay in town tonight if you need to rest." Lydia shook her head, surprised to find that, despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones from the long journey, she wanted to see where she would be living, wanted to understand what her new life would hold. "I would like to see the ranch, if that is acceptable. I have been traveling so long that another hour or two will make little difference, and I confess I am curious about my new home." Something in Daniel's expression softened, and he nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Of course. Let me get your trunks loaded and we will head out. It is about an hour's ride north of town. The land is beautiful, Miss Harper. I hope you will grow to love it as I do." She watched as he lifted her heavy trunks as though they weighed nothing, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt, and felt a flutter of something she could not quite name in her stomach. This was the man she was going to marry, the stranger who would become her husband, and she knew so little about him beyond what could be conveyed in letters. Yet there had been kindness in his eyes when he looked at her, and his first words had been generous rather than critical. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps this gamble would not prove to be the disaster her aunt had predicted when Lydia had announced her intentions. The wagon was sturdy and functional, and Daniel helped her up onto the seat with a gentle hand on her elbow, his touch brief but somehow significant, the first physical contact between them. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking his tongue at the two horses, and they began to move through the town and out onto a road that seemed to lead toward the distant mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the horizon. For a while, they rode in silence, and Lydia tried to absorb everything around her. The landscape was so different from Pennsylvania, so open and exposed that it felt almost frightening at first, as though there was nowhere to hide from the immensity of the sky and earth. But there was also a stark beauty to it, in the way the light played across the red rocks, in the scrub brush that somehow thrived in the harsh conditions, in the distant call of a bird she did not recognize. "I know it must seem very strange to you," Daniel said finally, his eyes on the road ahead. "After city life, it is lonely out here sometimes, I will not lie to you about that, but there is a freedom in it too, a sense that you can breathe fully. I hope you will come to appreciate it, even if it takes time." Lydia glanced at his profile, at the strong line of his jaw, and the way the sun caught in his dark hair. "I am not afraid of strangeness, Mr. Lawson. If I were, I would not have traveled halfway across the country to marry a man I have never met. And I think perhaps I needed to escape the confines of city life more than I needed its comforts." He turned to look at her then, and she saw surprise and something else in his eyes. "Please, call me Daniel. If we are to be married, formality seems unnecessary, and may I call you Lydia?" "Yes," she said softly. "I would like that. "Your letters," Daniel said, returning his attention to the horses but speaking more freely now. "They gave me hope that I had not felt in a long time. I know the circumstances of our arrangement are unusual, that most would call it madness to marry someone you have never met. But I felt, reading your words, that perhaps we could build something real together. Something good." Lydia felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I felt the same," she admitted. "I know we are strangers, Daniel, but I came here in good faith, ready to try to make a life with you. I will not pretend it is not frightening, but I am willing to work for this if you are." "I am," he said immediately, and there was such conviction in his voice that Lydia felt some of the fear that had been coiled in her chest begin to ease. "I want to be honest with you, Lydia. Ranch life is hard. There will be difficult days, times when money is tight, times when the weather or the cattle or a dozen other things go wrong. But I promise you I will do everything in my power to be a good husband to you, to provide for you and protect you and treat you with respect. That is all I can offer, but I offer it freely." "That is more than many women have in their marriages," Lydia said quietly, thinking of the society matches she had witnessed in Philadelphia, unions based on money and status where affection was an afterthought if it existed at all. "I do not expect perfection, Daniel. I only hope for honesty and kindness, and from what I have seen so far, you possess both qualities." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his face from handsome to something that made her heart skip. "You are generous in your assessment, but I will strive to live up to it." They continued on, and Daniel began to point out landmarks, telling her about the land, and the neighbors scattered across the territory, most of whom she would not meet for weeks or months given the distances involved. He spoke of his small herd of cattle, of his plans to expand once he had the resources, of the challenges of raising livestock in a climate that could be unforgiving. Lydia listened, asking questions when she did not understand, trying to absorb this new world she had entered. The ranch, when it came into view, was modest but well-maintained. A simple wooden house with a covered porch, a barn that looked sturdy, several corrals, and beyond it all, acres of open rangeland where she could see cattle grazing in the distance. It was isolated, no other buildings visible in any direction, and Lydia felt a momentary flutter of anxiety at the realization of just how alone they would be out here. But the house looked solid and welcoming in its own way, and there was something appealing about the idea of a place that would be entirely hers to manage, without the critical eyes of relatives watching her every move. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help her descend. His hands on her waist were warm and strong, and he held her a moment longer than strictly necessary, his eyes searching her face. "What do you think?" he asked, and she could hear the vulnerability beneath the question, the hope that she would not find his home lacking. "It is wonderful," Lydia said, and meant it. "It is more than I expected, truly. You have built something impressive here, Daniel." Relief flooded his features, and he released her, stepping back. "Come, let me show you inside. It is not fancy, but it is comfortable enough. I have been preparing for your arrival, trying to make sure everything is in order." The interior of the house was simple but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture that looked handmade, and windows that let in the afternoon light. Daniel showed her the 2 bedrooms, one larger than the other, and Lydia felt her cheeks warm as she realized the implication that soon she would be sharing the larger room with this man who was still so much a stranger to her. "I thought you might want some time before." Daniel trailed off, his own color rising. "I have been sleeping in the smaller room these past weeks, preparing the larger one for you. I can continue to do so until after the wedding, until you feel comfortable. I do not want you to feel pressured, Lydia. We may be planning to marry, but I want you to have a choice in how quickly we move toward that." Gratitude washed over her at his consideration. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness. When were you planning for the wedding to take place?" "I thought perhaps next week, if that gives you enough time to settle in and prepare. The minister comes through Las Lunas twice a month and he will be there next Saturday. But if you need more time, I can wait. There is no rush beyond what you are comfortable with." Lydia considered this. Part of her wanted to delay, to give herself more time to know this man before binding her life to his. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to be realistic during her years of dependence on her aunt, knew that delay would only prolong the uncertainty. She was here, she had committed to this path, and waiting would not make the decision any easier. "Next Saturday seems reasonable," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "That gives me a week to prepare, to learn the household, to grow more accustomed to being here." Daniel nodded, his eyes warm with approval. "Then next Saturday it is. In the meantime, I want you to make yourself at home here, Lydia. Anything you want to change or adjust in the house, please feel free to do so. I want this to be your home as much as it is mine." The days that followed established a rhythm that was both strange and oddly comfortable. Daniel rose before dawn each day to tend to the cattle and the various chores that ranch life demanded, and Lydia set about learning the house and its rhythms. She cooked meals on the iron stove, learning to judge the temperature by feel since it was so different from the modern ranges she had used in Philadelphia. She swept and cleaned and organized, finding satisfaction in the tangible results of her labor. Daniel was unfailingly polite, treating her with a careful courtesy that made her feel respected if somewhat at a distance. But in the evenings, after the work was done, and they sat together on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, they began to talk in ways that went beyond the practical matters of daily life. Daniel told her about growing up in Texas, about how he had come to New Mexico 5 years ago with dreams of building something of his own, about the loneliness that had finally driven him to place the advertisement for a wife. Lydia, in turn, found herself sharing more than she had intended about her own past, about the pain of losing her parents, about the slow erosion of her spirit in her aunt's household, about the courage it had taken to answer his letter. "I think you are braver than you give yourself credit for," Daniel said one evening, his voice quiet in the gathering darkness. "Coming out here alone, trusting a stranger with your future, that takes a kind of strength that I admire." Lydia felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I think perhaps we are both brave," she said. "You, for opening your life to someone unknown. Me, for stepping into that opening. Perhaps that is what it takes to build something new, a kind of mutual courage." Daniel reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they wrapped around hers. It was the first time he had initiated such contact, beyond helping her in and out of the wagon, and Lydia felt her pulse quicken at the warmth of his skin against hers. "I am grateful you answered my letter," he said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "More grateful than I know how to express. You are already more than I hoped for, Lydia. Not just in beauty, though you are beautiful, but in spirit and courage and kindness. I count myself fortunate beyond measure." She squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the emotion that clogged her throat. In her aunt's house, she had felt invisible, a burden to be tolerated. Here, in this wild and open place with this man who was still learning to know her, she felt seen and valued in ways that made her believe that perhaps she had made the right choice after all. The week passed more quickly than Lydia had anticipated. filled with preparations for the wedding and the gradual easing of the awkwardness between them. Daniel took her into town 2 days before the ceremony to purchase fabric for a new dress, insisting that she should have something special for the occasion, even though she protested the expense. She chose a simple but lovely cotton in a soft cream color, and spent the next 2 days sewing it with careful stitches, wanting to look her best for the man who would become her husband. Saturday arrived with clear skies and gentle warmth, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed like a blessing. Lydia dressed in her new gown, pinning her dark hair up carefully and allowing a few curls to frame her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the buttons, nerves and excitement mixing into a heady combination that made her feel slightly breathless. This was her wedding day, the day she would bind her life to Daniel Lawson's, and while fear still whispered at the edges of her mind, it was overshadowed now by hope and a growing affection for the man who had welcomed her so generously into his life. Daniel was waiting for her when she emerged from the bedroom, and the look on his face made all her efforts worthwhile. He stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide, before he seemed to remember himself and moved forward. "Lydia," he breathed, "you are breathtaking." She felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "You look very handsome yourself," she said, taking in his clean pressed shirt, the vest that emphasized his broad shoulders, the effort he had clearly made to look his best for their wedding day. The ceremony in the small church in Las Lunas was simple but meaningful. The minister was a kindly older man who spoke of the sanctity of marriage and the importance of mutual respect and devotion. There were a few witnesses present, neighbors who Daniel had invited, their faces curious and friendly as they watched the couple exchange their vows. When Daniel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Lydia felt tears prick her eyes at the reality of it all, at the fact that this was truly happening, that she was now Lydia Lawson, wife to this good man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said with a smile, and Daniel turned to her, his eyes asking permission even as his hands came up to gently cup her face. Lydia nodded, her heart racing, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft and brief, but carrying a promise of more to come. It was her first kiss, and she felt it all the way to her toes, a spark of something that made her believe that perhaps the physical aspects of marriage would not be the trial she had feared. The neighbors had arranged a small celebration at one of the larger homes in town, and Lydia found herself surrounded by well wishes and curious questions from the women who lived in the area. They were friendly and welcoming, offering advice about life in New Mexico and promising to visit once she was settled. It was more of a community than Lydia had expected to find in such a remote place, and she felt grateful for it, for the knowledge that she would not be entirely isolated. As the sun began to set, Daniel caught her eye across the room and made a small gesture toward the door. Lydia nodded, suddenly nervous again as she realized what came next, that they would return to the ranch as husband and wife, and that the careful distance they had maintained would now be bridged. They said their goodbyes and climbed into the wagon, the evening air cool and sweet as they began the journey home. "Are you tired?" Daniel asked as they drove, his voice gentle. "A little," Lydia admitted, though tired was not quite the right word for the nervous energy that thrummed through her body. "It has been an eventful day." "It has," Daniel agreed. He was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Lydia, I want you to know that I will never force you to anything. Tonight or any night. I know that the physical aspect of marriage can be frightening for women, and I want you to feel safe with me. We can take things as slowly as you need. Relief and something else, something like disappointment mixed with anticipation, flooded through her. "Thank you for your consideration," she said softly. "But Daniel, I am your wife now. I do not want to deny you your rights, and I confess I am curious as well as nervous. I trust you to be gentle with me." She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the wagon slow slightly as he turned to look at her in the fading light. "You honor me with that trust," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will do everything in my power to make tonight good for you, Lydia. To show you that there can be pleasure in the marriage bed, not just duty." Her cheeks burned at his frank words, but there was also a flutter of excitement low in her belly. She had heard whispered conversations among married women, had gathered that the marriage act could be either painful obligation or something more, depending on the man and the circumstances. She wanted to believe that with Daniel, who had been so kind and considerate in all their interactions, it might be the latter. The house was dark when they arrived, and Daniel lit lamps as they entered, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. Lydia stood uncertainly in the main room, her hands clasped in front of her, suddenly unsure of what came next. Daniel moved to stand before her, reaching out to take her hands in his touch warm and steady. "We do not have to rush," he said softly. "Would you like something to drink?" "To sit for a while," Lydia shook her head, gathering her courage. "I think if we delay, I will only become more nervous. I would rather we just proceed, if that is acceptable to you." A slow smile curved Daniel's lips, and he raised one of her hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "More than acceptable," he murmured. He led her to the larger bedroom, the one she had not yet slept in, and Lydia saw that he had placed fresh linens on the bed, that there were wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, small touches that showed he had thought about this moment and wanted it to be special for her. What followed was a revelation for Lydia. Daniel was patient and gentle, undressing her slowly and reverently, his hands and lips exploring her body with a tenderness that made her feel cherished rather than merely desired. He told her she was beautiful, that touching her was a privilege, that he wanted to learn what pleased her. When there was pain, he soothed it with whispered reassurances and careful movement. And when pleasure followed, bright and unexpected, Lydia cried out in surprise and wonder, her fingers digging into his shoulders as waves of sensation washed over her. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Lydia felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness but from relief and gratitude, and a profound sense that she had been right to take this risk, right to trust this man with her life and her body. Daniel felt the wetness against his chest and immediately raised himself on one elbow, his face concerned in the dim light from the window. "Did I hurt you?" "Lydia, I am so sorry if I was too rough. I tried to be careful." "No," she interrupted, placing her fingers against his lips to stop his worried words. "You were perfect, Daniel. These are happy tears, I promise. I did not know it could be like that. I did not know I could feel like that. Thank you for being so gentle with me, for making our wedding night something beautiful." Relief and something like pride crossed his face, and he bent to kiss her forehead, then her lips soft and sweet. "You are a gift, Lydia Lawson," he whispered against her mouth. "Every day I will try to be worthy of you." She curled against him, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I think we will be worthy of each other," she murmured, sleep beginning to tug at her consciousness. "I think we will be very happy, Daniel." "I think you are right," he agreed, his arms tightening around her, and Lydia let herself drift off, feeling safer and more content than she had in years. The weeks that followed established them as true partners in the running of the ranch. Lydia proved to be a quick learner, adapting to the demands of frontier life with a determination that impressed Daniel. She learned to manage the household with limited resources, to make do and improvise when supplies ran low. to preserve food and manage their small vegetable garden that she planted behind the house. Daniel taught her to ride, patient with her initial fear and awkwardness, until she could mount and control a horse well enough to accompany him on short rides around the property. Their physical relationship deepened and grew more comfortable, the initial shyness giving way to a familiarity that brought them closer together. They talked in the evenings, sharing their thoughts and dreams, learning each other's habits and preferences. Daniel proved to have a dry sense of humor that surprised her into laughter, and Lydia discovered that she could tease him in return, that he enjoyed her wit and did not expect her to be demure and silent like so many men of their era. 2 months into their marriage, they made a trip into Las Lunas for supplies, and Lydia was greeted warmly by the women she had met at the wedding celebration. They invited her to join their monthly quilting circle, and Lydia accepted gratefully, realizing how much she had missed female companionship. Daniel waited patiently while she visited with the other women, clearly pleased to see her forming connections in the community. On the ride home, Lydia felt content in a way she had never experienced before. The landscape that had seemed so strange and harsh when she first arrived now felt like home, the endless sky and open spaces no longer frightening but liberating. She looked over at Daniel, his strong hands guiding the horses, his profile etched against the sunset, and felt a rush of affection so strong it nearly took her breath away. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could question them, raw and honest in the quiet evening air. Daniel's hands jerked on the reins and he pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to stare at her with wide eyes. "What did you say?" Lydia felt her cheeks warm, but she held his gaze steadily. "I said I love you, Daniel. I know we have only been married a short time, and I know our union began as a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way, my feelings have become real. I love you, and I wanted you to know." For a long moment, Daniel simply looked at her, his eyes searching her face as though trying to read the truth of her words. Then he reached across the seat and pulled her to him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was fierce and tender all at once. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough. "I think I started falling for you the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, looking so brave and scared all at once. Every day since has only made me love you more. You are my partner, my friend, my wife, and I thank God every day that you answered my letter." Lydia felt tears stream down her face as she kissed him again, pouring all her joy and relief and love into the contact. They remained there for long minutes, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set around them, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed like a celebration of their declaration. As summer gave way to fall, Lydia began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She waited, not wanting to say anything until she was certain, observing the changes in her body with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. When 2 months passed without her courses, she finally told Daniel one evening as they sat together after supper. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice full of wonder, his hand immediately going to her still flat stomach. "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation," Lydia replied, covering his hand with hers. "How do you feel about it? I know it is sooner than we might have planned." Daniel's face split into the widest smile she had ever seen from him. "Planned? Lydia, this is the best news you could give me. A child, our child. I am thrilled, terrified, excited, all of it at once. We are going to be parents." His joy was infectious, and Lydia felt her own excitement grow. They spent the evening making plans, talking about what they would need to prepare, when the baby might arrive based on her calculations. Daniel became even more protective of her, insisting she not overwork herself, taking on tasks she had previously managed so that she would not strain herself. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Lydia's body changed, her belly swelling with their growing child, and Daniel seemed fascinated by every development, his hands constantly seeking her stomach to feel the baby move. The women from the quilting circle rallied around her, offering advice and helping to prepare baby clothes and blankets, their camaraderie a source of comfort as Lydia navigated the physical and emotional changes of impending motherhood. Winter in New Mexico was milder than what Lydia had experienced in Pennsylvania, but there were still cold days when frost covered the ground, and they huddled close to the fireplace for warmth. Daniel made sure they were well supplied with firewood and food, preparing for the possibility of being snowed in, even though it was relatively rare in their area. They spent long evenings together, Lydia sewing baby clothes while Daniel worked on carving a cradle, their conversation ranging from practical matters to dreams for their child's future. "You want a boy or a girl?" Lydia asked one evening, watching Daniel sand the wood smooth with careful strokes. He looked up, considering the question. "I do not have a preference," he said honestly. "A healthy child and a healthy wife, that is all I want. Though I confess the idea of a daughter with your eyes and spirit is appealing. And I think a son with your strength and kindness would be wonderful," Lydia replied with a smile. "I suppose we will get what we get, and love them regardless." "That we will," Daniel agreed, setting aside his work to come sit beside her, his arm going around her shoulders. "I cannot believe how much my life has changed in less than a year. When I placed that advertisement, I was hoping for companionship, for someone to share the burden of this life. I never imagined I would find love, that I would be sitting here with my wife carrying our child, feeling more content than I ever thought possible." Lydia leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I feel the same. When I left Philadelphia, I was running from a life that felt like a slow death. I hoped for something better, but I did not dare dream of something this good. You have given me a home, Daniel, not just a house, but a true home where I am valued and loved. Our child is blessed to have you as a father." "And you as a mother," Daniel said, kissing the top of her head. "We will do our best by this child, Lydia. Give them a life filled with love and opportunity. Teach them to be strong and kind and true. That is the legacy I want to leave." As her due date approached in late March, Daniel became increasingly anxious, hovering over Lydia and jumping at every wince or uncomfortable shift. She found his concern endearing even when it became slightly overwhelming. They had arranged for one of the women from town, Mrs. Patterson, who had experience with birthing, to come stay with them a week before the baby was expected, ready to assist with the delivery. The labor began on a cool morning, the first pains waking Lydia before dawn. She lay still for a moment, recognizing the sensation from what the other women had described, then reached over to touch Daniel's shoulder. He woke instantly, always a light sleeper, and saw immediately from her face that something was happening. "Is it time?" he asked, sitting up quickly, his hair disheveled and his eyes still slightly foggy with sleep. "I think it is beginning," Lydia said, breathing through another contraction. "It is still early, the pains are far apart, but you should probably fetch Mrs. Patterson." Daniel was out of bed and dressed in minutes, his movements quick and efficient despite the worry clear on his face. He helped Lydia to a comfortable position, brought her water, and then rode hard for town to bring back the midwife. By the time they returned, Lydia's contractions had intensified, coming closer together, and she was grateful for Mrs. Patterson's calm, experienced presence. The labor lasted through the day and into the evening, hours of pain and effort that tested Lydia's endurance. Daniel stayed close, holding her hand when she needed it, wiping her face with cool cloths, offering what comfort he could. Mrs. Patterson guided her through the process, her voice steady and reassuring, telling her when to push and when to rest. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the room in golden light, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that seemed to fill the entire house. Mrs. Patterson cleaned him quickly and placed him in Lydia's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her child, feeling a love so fierce and immediate it nearly overwhelmed her. "A son," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, we have a son." Daniel was kneeling beside the bed, his own eyes wet as he reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately curled around Daniel's, gripping with surprising strength, and Daniel let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He is perfect," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "Lydia, you are amazing. Look what you have done, look at this miracle." They named him David after Daniel's father, and he became the center of their world. The first weeks were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and the constant demands of a newborn, but they navigated it together, supporting each other through the challenges. Daniel proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring David to Lydia for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with the baby when he was fussy. As spring bloomed across the New Mexico landscape, their little family found its rhythm. Lydia marveled at how quickly David grew, how his eyes began to focus and follow them, how his first smile lit up his tiny face. She had never known she could feel this much love, that her heart could expand to hold both her husband and her child with equal intensity. One evening, when David was about 2 months old, Lydia sat on the porch with the baby in her arms while Daniel tended to the horses. She watched her husband work, efficient and strong, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been miserable in Philadelphia, invisible and unwanted. Now she was a wife and mother living a life she could not have imagined, loved beyond measure. Daniel finished with the horses and came to sit beside her, peering down at their sleeping son. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, his arm going around her shoulders. "About how much has changed," Lydia said. "About how answering your letter was the best decision I ever made. About how grateful I am for all of this, for you and David and this life we are building together." "I am the grateful one," Daniel said, turning to kiss her temple. "You took an enormous risk, Lydia, coming out here to marry a stranger. You could have found yourself in a terrible situation, married to a cruel man or living in conditions far worse than what you left behind. The fact that you trusted me, that you gave me a chance, that is something I will never take for granted." "You make it easy to trust you," Lydia replied. "From that first moment when you said I was more than you dreamed, you have shown me nothing but kindness and respect and love. You are a good man, Daniel Lawson, and I am proud to be your wife." They sat together as the sun set, their small family complete and content, and Lydia felt a peace she had never known before. This wild, open land had become her home. This man had become her partner in all things, and the child in her arms represented a future bright with possibility. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that threatened the cattle, harsh winters that tested their endurance, times when money was tight, and they had to make difficult choices about what to prioritize. But they faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. David grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, running through the house and yard with boundless energy. When he was 2, Lydia discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the news was met with excited anticipation from all 3 of them. though David was too young to fully understand what it meant. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1881, a tiny thing with wispy blonde hair and lungs that could wake the entire household. They named her Alina, after Lydia's mother, and David was instantly fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding, his chubby hands surprisingly gentle when he touched her. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Daniel expanded the herd, hired a hand to help with the increased workload, and built additions onto the house to accommodate their growing family. Lydia managed the household with competence and grace, her organizational skills and determination ensuring that, despite the hardships of frontier life, their home was comfortable and welcoming. The quilting circle remained an important part of Lydia's life, a connection to the community and a source of female friendship that sustained her. She formed particularly close bonds with two of the women, Sarah Mitchell and Anna Chen. The latter, a Chinese immigrant, married to a local shopkeeper who faced her own share of prejudice, but had found acceptance among the women of Las Lunas. Together, they supported each other through the various trials and triumphs of frontier motherhood, their children growing up together, their lives intertwined in the way that only shared experience could create. When David was 5 and Alina 3, Lydia found herself pregnant once more, this time unexpectedly but no less joyfully received. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas, was born in the winter of 1884, completing their family. The house was full of noise and laughter, and the controlled chaos that came with 3 young children, and both Daniel and Lydia thrived in the midst of it. Daniel proved to be the kind of father who was involved and present, despite the demanding nature of ranch work. He taught David to ride and rope, included him in age-appropriate chores, answered his endless questions with patience. He was gentle with Alina, encouraging her curiosity and intelligence even when it manifested in decidedly unladylike ways, like climbing trees and catching lizards. And baby Thomas was doted on by everyone, a sunny-tempered child who seemed to bring joy wherever he went. On their 7th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Lydia with a gift he had been planning for months. He had built her a small library room, converting unused space in the house, and filled it with books he had been ordering for months from catalogs. Knowing how much she missed the access to literature she had enjoyed in Philadelphia. Lydia was so moved by the gesture that she wept, throwing her arms around him and thanking him through her tears. "You gave up a lot to come here," Daniel said, holding her close. "The least I can do is bring a little bit of what you loved about your old life into our new one. I want you to be happy, Lydia. I want you to have everything your heart desires." "I have everything I need," Lydia replied, pulling back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "I have you, I have our children, I have this life we have built. The books are wonderful, and I will treasure them, but you are what makes me happy, Daniel. This family, this home, this is all I ever wanted even when I did not know it was what I was looking for." They had grown together over the years, from strangers united by practical necessity into true partners, bound by love and shared experience. The physical attraction that had been present from the beginning had deepened into something richer, an intimacy that went beyond the bedroom to encompass every aspect of their lives. They knew each other's moods and needs, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, finished each other's sentences and thoughts, but it was not just the two of them anymore. Their children were the living embodiment of their love, each one unique and precious. David was serious and responsible, already showing signs of the man he would become, protective of his younger siblings and eager to learn everything about ranching from his father. Alina was spirited and independent, with a mind that questioned everything and a will that sometimes clashed with expectations of how little girls should behave. Thomas was the peacemaker, sweet-natured and affectionate, able to charm his way out of most trouble. As the children grew, the ranch continued to flourish. The cattle operation expanded, Daniel's reputation for quality livestock spreading throughout the territory. They were able to make improvements to the property, add more stock, even purchase additional land. Money was no longer as tight as it had been in the early years, though they never forgot the lean times and remained careful with their resources. Lydia had become a respected figure in the Las Lunas community, known for her competence and kindness. She organized fundraisers for the church, helped new settlers adjust to frontier life, and became an informal advisor to other mail-order brides who arrived in the area, nervous and unsure. She always told them the same thing: give it time, be patient, look for the good in your new husband, and do not be afraid to work for happiness rather than waiting for it to appear. The years rolled on, marked by the seasonal rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their children's growth. There were challenges, of course. A bad drought in 1886 that killed off a portion of the herd and required them to purchase feed at inflated prices. Alina falling from a horse and breaking her arm when she was 8, the terror of it nearly stopping Lydia's heart until the doctor in town assured them it would heal cleanly. Thomas contracting a fever that had them worried sick for 3 days before it finally broke. But there were far more joys than sorrows. David's pride when he successfully roped his first calf at age 10. Alina learning to read and devouring every book in Lydia's library, her quick mind and sharp wit promising a bright future. Thomas showing an unexpected talent for music, his voice pure and sweet when he sang at church services. The quiet moments of family gathered around the dinner table, sharing the events of the day, the laughter and teasing and love that flowed between them. Daniel and Lydia's relationship continued to deepen with each passing year. They still made time for each other despite the demands of children and ranch, stealing moments alone on the porch after the children were asleep, occasionally arranging for a neighbor to watch the kids so they could spend a day in town together. The physical passion that had ignited their wedding night had not faded but matured into something even more satisfying, a deep knowing of each other's bodies and desires that brought them both pleasure and closeness. When Lydia turned 40 in 1896, she found herself reflecting on the nearly 20 years since she had stepped off that stagecoach in Las Lunas, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. She had been so young then, though she had not felt it at the time, so uncertain of what the future held. Now, looking at her life, she could hardly recognize that frightened girl in the confident woman she had become. Daniel had organized a surprise celebration for her birthday, inviting friends and neighbors to the ranch for an evening of food and music and dancing. Lydia was overwhelmed by the turnout, by the affection so clearly displayed by the community that had become her family over the years. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Daniel pulled her onto the porch, away from the remaining stragglers. "Happy birthday, my love," he said, producing a small wrapped package from his pocket. 20 years since you came into my life and changed everything. I wanted to mark the occasion with something special." Lydia unwrapped the package with careful fingers, gasping when she saw the delicate gold locket inside. She opened it to find tiny photographs of their 3 children, their faces captured by the photographer who had visited Las Lunas the previous year. "Daniel, it is beautiful," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. He took the locket and fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle on her skin. Not as beautiful as you, he said, turning her to face him. 20 years, Lydia, and I love you more today than I did the day we married. You are my best friend, my partner, the love of my life. Thank you for answering my letter all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy with more dreams than sense. Lydia reached up to cup his face, her thumb brushing across his cheekbone. They had both aged, lines appearing at the corners of eyes and mouths, silver threading through hair, but to her, he was as handsome as he had been that first day when he had looked at her with wonder and said she was more than he dreamed. You are the best decision I ever made, she said firmly. This life, this family, all of it has been beyond anything I imagined possible. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, Daniel. I would choose you every single time. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Lydia felt the same spark she had felt at their wedding, the same connection that had only grown stronger with time and shared experience. Around them, the New Mexico night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant cattle, the sky overhead brilliant with stars, and Lydia felt a contentment so complete it seemed to fill every cell of her body. The children were growing into young adults now, their paths beginning to diverge as they discovered their own interests and dreams. David, at 18, was essentially running the ranch alongside his father, his skills and judgment trusted implicitly. He had begun courting a young woman from town, the daughter of the feed store owner, and Lydia could see a wedding on the horizon within a year or two. Eleanor, at 16, was chafing against the limitations placed on young women of the era. She wanted to continue her education beyond what was available in Las Lunas, talked about becoming a teacher or even attending university back east, ideas that were radical for a girl in rural New Mexico. Daniel and Lydia discussed it at length, weighing their desire to support their daughter's ambitions against their concerns about sending her so far away. She has your spirit, Daniel said one night as they lay in bed, discussing Eleanor's future. That same courage and determination that brought you out here. I think we have to let her try, Lydia. We have to trust that we have raised her well enough to handle whatever challenges she faces. I know you are right, Lydia sighed. But the thought of her so far away, in a world that is not always kind to women with ambition, it terrifies me. She is stronger than she looks, Daniel said, pulling Lydia close. She has your strength and intelligence and my stubbornness. I think Eleanor is going to be just fine, wherever life takes her, and she will always know she has a home here to come back to. Thomas, at 12, was still finding his way, interested in music and books more than ranching, though he did his share of chores without complaint. There was a gentleness to him that reminded Lydia of her father, a sensitivity that she hoped the world would not harden out of him as he grew. Life continued its steady progression through the late 1890s. David did indeed marry his sweetheart in 1898, a joyous celebration that saw the ranch filled with guests and the house ringing with music and laughter. Lydia cried watching her eldest son pledge his life to his bride, seeing in him echoes of the man his father had been at that age, good and true, and ready to build a life with the woman he loved. Eleanor left for a teaching college in Colorado in 1899, her departure leaving a hole in the household that took months to adjust to. But her letters were frequent and filled with excitement about her studies, about the women she was meeting, about the ideas she was being exposed to. Lydia saved every letter, proud beyond measure of her daughter's courage and determination. Thomas surprised them all by showing not just musical talent but academic prowess as well, his grades in the Las Lunas school exceptional. The teacher suggested he might benefit from attending a better school, perhaps even preparing for university. And Daniel and Lydia found themselves once again discussing their children's futures and how best to support them. In 1900, Lydia and Daniel celebrated their 22nd anniversary quietly. Just the two of them, since David had his own household now, and Thomas was staying with a friend in town for the weekend. They rode out to a favorite spot on the ranch, a high point that overlooked miles of their land, and sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Giving up city life, coming out here to marry a stranger?" Lydia turned to look at him, seeing the threads of silver in his hair, the lines that hard work and sun had etched into his face, the steadiness in his eyes that had drawn her to him from the start. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life has been everything I never knew I wanted, Daniel. You are everything I never knew I needed. I would live it all again exactly the same way, every challenge, every triumph, because it brought me here to this moment with you." "I feel the same," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "That day you stepped off the stagecoach, I thought I was getting a wife, a partner to share the work of the ranch. I had no idea I was getting my soulmate, the love of my life, the woman who would make every single day better just by being in it. You are my greatest blessing, Lydia Lawson." They sat together as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, their love a living thing that had grown and evolved and deepened over more than 2 decades. The ranch sprawled below them, testament to their hard work and partnership. Their children were carving their own paths in the world, secure in the foundation of love and support their parents had provided. And the future stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility. The early 1900s brought changes to Las Lunas and the surrounding territory. New Mexico was moving toward statehood, bringing with it improvements in infrastructure and services, but also challenges as the frontier era slowly gave way to modernity. The railroad came through, making travel and shipping easier, but also bringing more settlers and changing the character of the region. David and his wife welcomed their first child in 1902, making Daniel and Lydia grandparents. Holding her grandson for the first time, Lydia felt the circle complete in a way, seeing her son as a father just as she and Daniel had been, watching him navigate the same fears and joys they had experienced. Daniel was utterly besotted with the baby, his first grandchild, and made frequent trips to visit David's family, bringing gifts and advice and unbounded affection. Elena returned home in 1903 with her teaching certificate and a confidence that had only grown during her time away. She took a position teaching at the school in Las Lunas. Her modern methods and insistence on high standards, sometimes clashing with the more traditional expectations of the community. But she was effective and beloved by her students, and Lydia was fiercely proud of the woman her daughter had become. Thomas graduated from the local school with honors, and with his parents' blessing and financial support, left for university in Albuquerque in 1904. It was hard for Lydia to have another child leave home, but she recognized that each of them needed to find their own way in the world, just as she had done so many years ago when she answered Daniel's advertisement. With the children grown and launched into their own lives, Lydia and Daniel found themselves with time and space to focus on each other in ways they had not been able to when the children were young. They traveled more, making trips to Santa Fe and even once to Denver, seeing parts of the country beyond New Mexico. They invested in improvements to the ranch, modernizing where it made sense while maintaining the core operations that had sustained them for decades. Their love had transformed over the years from the uncertain beginning of strangers taking a chance on each other to the deep, abiding partnership of two people who had built a life together from nothing. They knew each other's histories and habits, strengths and weaknesses, hopes and fears. They had weathered losses together, including the death of several close friends and the painful miscarriage Lydia had suffered between Alina and Thomas, a loss that had brought them even closer as they mourned together. They had celebrated triumphs, supported each other through difficulties, raised 3 children who were now making their own marks on the world. In 1910, as they approached their 32nd anniversary, Daniel planned a special trip back to Philadelphia for Lydia. She had not been back since leaving in 1878, and he knew she sometimes wondered about the places and people of her past. They made the journey by train, a far cry from the arduous stagecoach ride she had endured decades earlier, and spent a week exploring the city she had once called home. It was strange for Lydia to walk streets she had not seen in over 30 years, to find some places exactly as she remembered and others completely transformed. They visited the house where she had lived with her aunt, now occupied by strangers, and Lydia felt nothing but gratitude that she had escaped that life. They went to her parents' graves, where she placed flowers and told them about the life she had built, the family she had raised, the happiness she had found. "I used to dream about leaving," Lydia said to Daniel as they stood in the cemetery. "But I never truly imagined it would happen, that I would have the courage to take such a risk. And now, looking back, I cannot imagine my life any other way. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Daniel. Thank you for being the kind of man I could build a life with." "Thank you for taking the chance," Daniel replied, taking her hand. "Thank you for seeing potential in a lonely cowboy's advertisement and being brave enough to answer it. Everything good in my life stems from that moment, Lydia. You, our children, our grandchildren, all of it exists because you were willing to step into the unknown." They returned to New Mexico feeling even more connected, the trip having reinforced how far they had come together and how much they had built. The ranch was thriving under David's capable management, with Daniel taking a less active role as he aged, content to offer advice and guidance while his son handled the day-to-day operations. Alina had married a fellow teacher in 1911, a good man who shared her progressive views and supported her continued work, and Lydia was overjoyed to see her daughter find partnership of the kind she and Daniel shared. Thomas finished his university studies and returned to New Mexico, taking a position as a clerk in the territorial government in Santa Fe, his education and intelligence serving him well. More grandchildren arrived over the years, David's family growing to include 4 children, Alina welcoming 2, and even Thomas eventually marrying and starting a family. Lydia reveled in her role as grandmother, taking joy in the young ones who visited the ranch, teaching them skills just as she had taught their parents, telling them stories of the old days when Las Lunas was barely more than a collection of buildings and the frontier was truly wild. Daniel's health began to decline in his early 70s, nothing dramatic but a general slowing, aches and pains that accumulated with age. Lydia found herself in the role of caretaker more often, making sure he took his medicines, did not overwork himself, rested when he needed to. He chafed against the limitations at first, but accepted them when she pointed out that she had every intention of keeping him around for many more years, and he needed to cooperate with that plan. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, their children organized a massive celebration at the ranch, inviting seemingly everyone they had ever known. The house and yard were filled with people, 3 generations of family plus friends and neighbors, all gathered to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in Las Lunas. 50 years of marriage was remarkable anywhere, but especially in the frontier, turned territory, turned state of New Mexico, where hardship could end lives and relationships with brutal efficiency. Lydia wore a new dress for the occasion, her hair now fully silver, her face lined with the marks of 7 decades of living. But her eyes were still bright, her smile still ready, and when she looked at Daniel across the crowded yard, she felt the same flutter in her chest that she had experienced when he first told her she was more than he dreamed. Daniel stood with the help of a cane now, his body bent slightly with age, but his love for Lydia shone as clearly as it ever had. When the time came for speeches, he insisted on standing without support, holding Lydia's hand as he addressed the assembled crowd. 50 years ago, I placed an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper looking for a wife, he said, his voice carrying despite his age. I was lonely and foolish enough to think that a practical arrangement could solve that loneliness. What I got instead was so much more than I ever dreamed possible. Lydia Harper stepped off a stagecoach in Las Lunas as a stranger and became my wife, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. She has given me 3 incredible children, more grandchildren than I can count, and 50 years of happiness I did nothing to deserve. She took a chance on a cowboy she had never met, and made that cowboy the luckiest man in New Mexico. Lydia, I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Lydia stood on her toes to kiss him, the applause thunderous around them. She took her turn to speak, her voice strong despite her emotion. I was terrified when I came here, she said, looking out at the sea of faces. Terrified of the unknown, of marrying a stranger, of life in a place so different from everything I had known. But from the moment I met Daniel, he made me feel safe and valued and seen. He has been my rock, my joy, my home for 50 years. We have built a life together from nothing, raised a family I am endlessly proud of, and created a legacy that will outlive us both. I took a risk answering his letter, but it was the best decision I ever made. Daniel Lawson, you are still more than I ever dreamed, and I love you with everything I am. They celebrated long into the night, music and laughter filling the air, the ranch alive with the life and love that Daniel and Lydia had cultivated over 5 decades. As the party finally wound down and the guests departed, their children and grandchildren hugged them goodbye, leaving the elderly couple alone on their porch, sitting in the chairs they had occupied for so many evenings over the years. Quite a day, Daniel said, his voice tired but content. Quite a life, Lydia replied, taking his hand. 50 years, Daniel. I can hardly believe it. Best 50 years any man could ask for, Daniel said, raising her hand to his lips. Thank you for every single one of them, my love. They sat together watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, the New Mexico night wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. The ranch was quiet now, the cattle settled, the buildings solid and enduring. Everything they had built together stretched out around them, tangible proof of what 2 people could create when they chose to trust each other, to work together, to love without reservation. Daniel and Lydia continued on together for several more years, their health gradually declining but their spirits remaining strong. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own, saw New Mexico navigate the Depression years, supported each other through the inevitable losses that came with age as friends and contemporaries passed away. When Daniel finally passed peacefully in his sleep in 1934, at the age of 84, Lydia grieved deeply but without regrets. They had lived a full life together, loved completely, and left a legacy that would endure for generations. She held his hand as he slipped away, whispering her love and gratitude, reminding him of that first day when he had called her more than he dreamed. Lydia lived for 2 more years, surrounded by family, her mind sharp even as her body failed. She spent her final months sorting through letters and photographs, writing down stories for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, wanting them to know the history of how their family began. She wrote about the courage it took to answer that advertisement, about the uncertainty and hope mingled together, about how a practical arrangement became the greatest love story she could imagine. When she passed quietly in her sleep in 1936, her children found among her belongings the original photograph Daniel had sent her all those years ago, creased and faded, along with every letter they had exchanged before her arrival in Las Lunas. But most treasured was a journal entry from 1878, written shortly after their wedding, where she had written in her careful script, "He said I was more than he dreamed. I think he is more than I dreamed too. I believe we are going to be very happy." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their headstones simple but bearing an inscription chosen by their children. Two strangers who became soulmates. A love built on courage, sustained by partnership, perfected by time. The ranch remained in the family, passing down through David's line, each generation adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Daniel and Lydia had built. The house was preserved and expanded, becoming a gathering place for the sprawling family that had grown from one courageous decision and two people willing to take a chance on love. In Las Lunas, the story of Daniel and Lydia Lawson became part of local legend, told and retold over the decades. The mail-order bride who came west with nothing but hope, and the lonely rancher who recognized her worth the moment he saw her. Their love story became a testament to the power of courage and trust, to the incredible things that could be built when two people committed to working together toward a common future. Their great-grandchildren would eventually write a book about their story, interviewing elderly relatives who remembered them, compiling letters and photographs, preserving the history of how a simple advertisement in 1878 led to a dynasty. The book became required reading in New Mexico schools, a piece of state history that captured the spirit of the frontier era while also telling a deeply human story of love and partnership. But beyond the legend and the history, Daniel and Lydia's real legacy lived on in the values they had instilled in their descendants: the courage to take risks, the importance of partnership, the power of seeing worth in others, the necessity of hard work balanced with care for family, the beauty of building something lasting together. Their story began with Lydia stepping off a stagecoach in Las Lunas, her heart full of fear and hope, and Daniel looking at her with wonder in his eyes. It began with his words, "You're more than I dreamed," and her slow realization that perhaps he was more than she had dreamed too. It unfolded over 56 years of marriage marked by joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, but above all by love and unwavering commitment to each other. And though both were long gone, their love story endured, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a leap of faith, that strangers can become soulmates, and that a practical arrangement can transform into the deepest and most abiding love. Their story proved that courage and trust can build foundations that last for generations, and that two people willing to work together can create something far greater than either could achieve alone. In the end, Lydia Harper, who became Lydia Lawson, had not just come west to wed a man she had never seen. She had come to find herself, to discover strength she did not know she possessed, to build a legacy that would outlast her mortal years. And Daniel Lawson had not just been looking for a wife to ease his loneliness. He had been searching for a partner, a love, a woman who would match him in courage and determination, and transform his solitary existence into a shared adventure. They had found all that and more in each other. And their love, born from a chance correspondence and nurtured through decades of partnership, became a beacon for all who came after them. Proof that the greatest love stories are not the ones that begin with certainty, but the ones that begin with courage.